have you all here, and really looking forward to spending the next hour or so with you, talking about unconscious bias. Quite a buzzword at the moment. There's a lot of talk about unconscious bias in the media, crops up in training conversations, in coaching a lot. And that's really also why I am interested in this. Sort of as an interculturalist, as an executive coach, you're quite often talking to people about those situations where they're not quite sure about something. People have a quick judgment, think, oh, that's absolutely right. And then afterwards think, oh, actually, that was absolutely not the correct interpretation of this situation. There was something going on here with me that I wasn't fully aware of. So a great topic, and hopefully we can shed some light on what's going on in that field today. So what have we prepared for you? So we'll quickly talk about why this matters. Why is it so important for us that we are aware of unconscious bias? We'll do a little bit of background. There is a book which I absolutely love called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And he calls our brain a machine for jumping to conclusions. So we'll have a little look at that to give some sort of scientific background to what it is we're talking about. Then we will look at some examples of unconscious bias, and where does unconscious bias come from and what are the dangers of it. We will also look at confirmation bias. So you might be aware of situations where, or you've come across groups of people where if you're just surrounding yourself with people who are absolutely like you and you always have your opinions confirmed, then you will feel really strongly about certain opinions, impressions, and they might not necessarily be realistic or the right ones. And we will finish the session by talking about what we can actually do about unconscious bias, or at least try to do about unconscious bias, because to think that you will always be, or at any stage, be completely safe from unconscious bias is probably totally unrealistic. But what we can do is try and be aware of it, and just adjust our reactions accordingly. Okay, so let's get stuck in. To start with, I would just like to tell you a story. This story is around quite a lot. I have even heard it on the radio when people discuss unconscious bias. So if you have heard this story before, please do not write anything in the chat box or share that now. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to ask you a question at the end, and please use the chat box to provide your thoughts on what is going on. So the story goes as follows. A father and his son are driving along in their car. Unfortunately, they have a really terrible car accident, catastrophic car accident, and the father dies. The boy is rushed to hospital, is wheeled into the operating theatre in the local hospital. The surgeon comes into the room and says, "Oh my God, I can't operate. This is my son." What do you think is going on? If you know the answer, please don't share it yet if you have heard this before. If you've never heard this before, please use the chat box to share any ideas of what might be going on in this story. The real answer, and the real answer is, of course, the surgeon is the mother. So I have actually used this story with the staff of a hospital. And even there, nobody who hadn't heard this before came up with the solution that the surgeon is the mother, which is why she's able to say, I can't operate, this is my son. Women are surgeons, yeah, so not an awful lot of them, but I was totally caught out by this when I first heard it. I was absolutely captured in my unconscious bias that surgeons are men, and a large proportion of them are, but it is not. Yes, a lot of me too down there. It is not unheard of, and there are certainly a certain percentage of surgeons who are women. But it is one of those stories where we come very quickly aware of our own unconscious bias and what it does to us and how it shuts down our thinking. And we just don't go down that route, which is in fact the correct one. So let's have a quick think about unconscious bias. What do you think? What is unconscious bias? Please use the chat box to write down anything that comes to your mind when you think about this whole concept of unconscious bias, from what you've experienced, from what you've heard so far. What is it? What characterizes unconscious bias? I can see multiple attendees are typing, which is very encouraging. Looking forward to what we'll see there in a moment. Implicit, yes, absolutely. Several other people are also still typing. Expectations that we have, Katja says, certain categories that we've formed, yeah. Unconscious makes us think that we can't do anything about it. Quick judgments, confirmation to preconceived notions, absolutely. Treating people based on generalizations and assumptions about appearance, age, gender, and race, absolutely. Very important that it does affect those crucial parts of who we are and how we think of people. Beliefs, assumptions that are made based on our experiences and backgrounds that share our behavior and thoughts. Yeah, Angela making quick judgments. Marcus, spontaneously, absolutely. Marta, personal experiences, stereotypes. Mindset, basing your opinions on others' judgment of people or situations. That's very good because it implies it's not necessarily your experience, but it's something that comes from others. So thank you very much for that. That's really great. Just a few other things here to add. So Marcus, you said spontaneous. We can almost turn that into automatic. So it's not a conscious thing that's going on, but we just spontaneously, quickly, automatically jump to a certain conclusion. It quite often turns out that it means that we are in favor of something or against something. Quite often this unconscious bias can be quite black and white, quite definite. What else do we have? We are unaware of it. We are not necessarily clear about where this just came from, or that it is actually only a sort of biased opinion. It can quite often be unfair. So it's not based on real criteria or on things that we know about people, but it's just simply a judgment. And another point that we really, really need to keep in mind is that everybody is biased. Nobody is free from this. No matter how hard you work at yourself, no matter how hard you try and be aware of stereotypes and so on, this will happen to you, as it happened to many of us with that example with the son and the father and the surgeon. Yeah, it's just an automatic thing, and it can happen to all of us. So where does it come from? Some people have already pointed to this in some of the chat contributions that you've made. So our upbringing, of course, is a crucial factor on this. The things that we've sort of imbibed with our mother's milk, with the the very early influences, the sort of values that our parents, our family, our teachers have instilled in us, we quite uncritically, certainly to start with, just take all that on board, and it becomes part of who we think we are and what we think is normal. And therefore, sort of the norm, the standard for what we think people should be like or behavior should be like. It's also a lot to do with the level of diversity that we have been exposed to. So I grew up in a small village in northern Germany. And the people around me were pretty much all of the same or roughly the same socioeconomic background. There were variations in levels of education. There was certainly no ethnic mix at all in my background. And I think that you probably still find little sort of situations surrounding communities like that all over the world, where there's just a total lack of diversity. So you then compare that to somebody who grows up, say, in East London and goes to school there, lives in a totally mixed neighborhood, works with people from all sorts of different backgrounds. Of course, their mindset in terms of the diversity of people, behaviors, and so on is a totally different one, and really broadens your horizons enormously when you then go through life and meet people from all over the world. So it can be an uphill struggle for people who've basically grown up without much diversity around them. But of course, as you vary the people you surround yourself with, the environments that you move in and so on, your openness will also change. The narratives that we have heard, many cultures that we move in, whether it's a national culture, professional culture, come with certain narratives. And some of those narratives can be to do with, say, a sense of superiority. We are really good at this. We are the greatest nation on earth. All sorts of things that you might have heard out there in the media. And again, we are quite often quite uncritical of these narratives that we are exposed to and that we have just accepted. Everybody is, I'm afraid. So this quite often leads to a set of beliefs that we might have about what is good, what is bad, what is professional, what's unprofessional, what's constructive and not. So quite deeply held opinions and attitudes and beliefs. It's also, of course, a lot to do with our experiences. Maybe we have had a set of bad experiences with people from a certain group or certain situations, and then next time we come into a similar situation, you think, oh God, I know exactly what this is going to be like. And our mind shuts down before we've even given the situation and the people in that situation a chance to prove us wrong. And therefore, we will also have certain expectations of people, of situations, and how they are going to play out. So there are many more factors which do influence us here, but these are just a few of the main ones that come to mind. Now, what's actually going on in our brains when these sorts of things happen? So let me quickly point you to one of my favorite books, which is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And he really talks about our brain as being this sort of dual system. And without giving you a synopsis of the whole book here, which would take us until tonight, just a couple of main points. He talks about system 1 in our brain and system 2. And the sort of the dominant one that we use most of the time is system 1. And that is fast, it's intuitive, it makes associations, it's fairly automatic, impressionistic, and can't be switched off. So we've constantly got our system one going on in our brain, scanning the environment, what's going on around us, the situation around us, and processing all that input really quickly and coming up with behaviors, reactions to that. We've evolved in that. That's usually really good for us. It keeps us away from danger, keeps us safe. So it's generally a pretty good system to have. But at times, it leads us down the wrong path. And he calls it a machine for jumping to conclusions. A little bit more about that in a minute. So in order to safeguard us from making lots of mistakes and errors, we also have a system 2 in our brain. And that is much more slow, it's deliberate, it takes some effort to use our system 2. And this takes over when things get difficult or unclear, or we don't quite know what to do with all the input that is coming to us. So where this is interesting in terms of unconscious bias is really this quote that I've put in here, where I said he calls system 1 a machine for jumping to conclusions. So just to read this out, so this is directly quoted from his book. Jumping to conclusions is efficient if the conclusions are likely to be correct and the costs of an occasional mistake is acceptable, and if the jump saves much time and effort. Jumping to conclusions is risky when the situation is unfamiliar, the stakes are high, and there is no time to collect more information. And these are then the circumstances in which intuitive errors are probable. So this gives you a little bit of background as to what's actually going on in our brains. Just one attempt of explaining that. And I think what we should take away from this in terms of thinking about unconscious bias is that we all do this automatically. And generally, it's good for us to understand the environment quickly, to find all the relevant points and act accordingly. But there are times when we need to deliberately switch on our system 2 and say, hang on a minute, what is actually really going on here? Do I have all the information? Do I need to interpret this differently? And I can also only recommend that you read this book. It's really one of the most insightful ones that I have ever worked my way through. And it is effort, I tell you. It takes ages. Read it slow in order to get the most out of it. So what does this mean in practical situations? So one thing that Kahneman talks about as well, but which is not his invention, this term, it's generally being used quite a lot in psychology, is the so-called halo effect. So we quite often form an impression of somebody within seconds. Imagine you're at a conference, you're sitting there, hopefully fairly awake, looking forward to the day, and you see all the panel of future speakers, and you probably, just from what they look like, you form an initial impression, and then these people get up and go to the microphone, and there's one person who sort of stands up straight and has loads of energy, smiles, looks really good, and you think, I believe every word this person's going to say. Somewhere in your system 1, that's what's going on. You might then have some second thoughts about that, but usually there is something about people that makes us look at them favorably or more negatively. So this positive opinion might be based on what we have heard about somebody. So you've read their papers before the conference, or there was a lot of info about them in the conference papers, and you think, oh, this will be really interesting. How attractive they are, whether you think they are an attractive looking person, what they sound like. Do they sound fairly confident, speaking with a clear voice, or is there a little tremor and they're not really speaking up? How confident they seem, generally whether we like them, whether they are like one of us. And that quite often leads to us giving people a lot of positive credit, but also, and this is the dangerous stuff, to us discrediting people who don't fulfill all those criteria and to whom we don't immediately react positively. So quite often this is also to do with language ability. So we're all using English. I'm speaking English as a foreign language right at the moment. We're all using English to communicate, whether we're a Finnish person talking to a Brazilian or somebody from Africa talking to someone from Iceland or whatever, we're using English. And some of us speak it more fluently than others. So one danger, one mistake we can make is to mistake language proficiency for professional ability and input that this person can give. So being aware of the halo effect, enjoying it while it lasts, but also being sort of skeptical of it and thinking, I wonder about that person in the corner who's being really quiet. I wonder what they've got to say. And sort of consciously counteracting it, I think, could be a useful way of trying to avoid too much unconscious bias. But we usually form our opinions in split seconds. So, and we see things the way we want to see them. So I'm sure you have seen this before. Some of us, I guess, will see a young man from the front, sort of as if he were fully facing you, and just half of his body and face is whitened out. Others will see that same young man, but see him in profile from the side. So you can see his fringe sticking out at the top in a very fashionable way. You can see his nose and so on. And how you see it is an instantaneous thing. So everybody who sees this picture first time sees it either from the front or from the side. And only after a while do you start to think, actually, there are different ways of looking at this. And that's, of course, also the same with situations. So we've got this little scene here for you. What's your first impression? What do you think is going on here? And if I could ask you to use the chat box again to come up with some sort of explanation of what might be going on here, that'd be really great. So what's happening? So several people are typing. Let's see what the opinions will be. That encouraging line, multiple attendees are typing. Okay, so Katja thinks, at first I thought they were arguing, but now I see the other lady is trying to see something very closely. Oh yes, so as if she was said, you've got something on your cheek or something, and you're looking very closely at what that is. So Shams thinks the colleague on the left is making a statement, the colleague on the right is weighing the options, and another one is just sitting and listening. Okay, Joe thinks the woman leaning in is looking at the other woman's face. Doesn't look aggressive due to her facial expression. Stephanie, misunderstanding. Okay, Yasmin thinks they're having an argument, as the other one looks sarcastic with hands raised, and the other one is leaning in aggressively. Yeah, fair dues. The two women seem to be arguing while the man is in the middle, seems a bit in the argument, a bit lost. They finished greeting each other and the man moved away. Maybe the lady on the left can't hear the one on the right. Brilliant. So it's always amazing the different interpretations that can come to mind. And I must say, a lot of you are being very sort of careful in your opinions and really trying to look clearly at what you can see and what is going on there. We've had much more sort of prejudiced things like these women are fighting, they are having one of them is having an affair with the man and they've just found out. So all sorts of things that can come to people's mind here. But I think what this shows very, very nicely, looking at all your reactions there, is how what we can see can be totally different from person to person. So the different interpretations of what is going on there are really different for every person who looks at such a picture. And in the same way, the biases that we might have, some of them will be expressed in how we see this picture, but they will also be different from person to person. Okay, great. So why does all this matter? We've talked a little bit about what it is, where it comes from, but why does it actually matter? So let me show you this picture here. I think probably everybody on the call will know what I'm referring to here, right? Or is there anybody who doesn't know what's going on here, who hasn't seen this before? So if anybody needs a quick explanation, I'm happy to provide it. All right, okay. So basically what was happening here was that this is Professor Robert Kelly. He works at a university in Korea, and he's one of the acknowledged experts when it comes to Korean politics. He was doing an interview with the BBC, live on BBC television, from his home in Korea. Oh, yeah, actually it was in Korea, but that's beside the point. And while he was doing that, the worst nightmare of anyone who's working from home, his children entered the room. So you can see the little girl there in the yellow jumper, and then the little sibling comes in as well in the stroller at the back there. So brave Robert Kelly kept going with his interview, although of course on his camera, in the same way that I can see what's behind me right now, he saw his children come into the room. So that was all very funny. And you then see a woman coming into the room, an Asian-looking woman, who tries her very hardest to coax the children out of the room so that Daddy can continue his interview in peace and quiet. Now, the reason why I've got this here as we are talking about unconscious bias was because there was an interesting discussion around the identity of the woman who comes in to coax the children out of the room. Because initially quite a lot of sort of reaction on social media and also in some news outlets was that the nanny came in to collect the children. Vera Chokden had an article in the Guardian newspaper called "If You Saw a Nanny in This BBC Interview, What Does That Say About You?" Because in fact, the lady who comes in to collect the children is Professor Kelly's wife. But clearly there was some unconscious bias kicking in here for some people on social media and so on, thinking an Asian-looking lady, she can only be the nanny, as opposed to this white professor's wife. So an example of where unconscious bias can actually start to become a bit dangerous, discriminatory, and we have to, sorry, what was, okay, so we had some comment there in the chat box, which at the moment I can't quite make sense of. Leo, maybe provide a bit more information and we'll discuss it at the end, yeah? So there was some of the reaction there was clearly driven by unconscious bias towards the lady who came into the room. So going a little bit broader on this, So why does unconscious bias matter? Because it's clearly a matter of fairness and avoiding discrimination. So one example in the research on unconscious bias, there was a project, an experiment done on this in the United States, where 130 scientists were sent the same CV for a new position that they might have, say for a research executive. The CVs were all 100% identical apart from the name. And this was around gender. So half of the names on the CVs were female, and the names on the other half of CVs were male. When it came to assessing the CVs, across the board, the competence of those applicants with a male name was judged as higher. And in terms of starting salary, there was an average difference of about $10,000 a year between those applicants with the male name and those with the female name. So clearly, people's opinion of the ability of those applicants was swayed by the name. And this, in this experiment, was about gender, but I think there's plenty of research as well into names which infer certain nationalities and so on, and how that can be the basis for discrimination as well. So really, really crucial that we're aware of this when it comes to recruitment, when it comes to promotions within an organization, when it comes to who is worth to mentor and support, and generally treating people equally. Also, why does this matter? Because we just don't get the true picture of who we have around us. We shut down some people and relationships too quickly, don't really give them a chance because we've sort of been biased against them too quickly. And therefore, we sort of lose out on valuable exchanges and possibilities. And we can generally lose out on the benefits of diversity. And we'll get back to those in a minute. Before we do, quick aside on confirmation bias. So this is sort of a subset of unconscious bias. And sometimes we look at a situation, we look at a person in order to have our opinions confirmed. And we can come out with statements like, I knew it. I knew this was going to happen. We also call this self-fulfilling prophecies. So we evaluate and interpret situations in a way which confirms pre-existing beliefs. And therefore, we choose to look at things only through those pre-existing beliefs. So, for example, if you're doing some research or you're interpreting some statistics, you can slightly manipulate those or steer those. Manipulate is maybe too strong a word, but just sort of shape those in a way that they produce the outcomes that you want. And you can see so many statistics out there which have clearly been used in that way. We even get to the point where we refuse to gather additional information because it might spoil our story. And we say, oh no, I don't need to know that, don't need to know that. I've made up my mind. And that's particularly frequent if we surround ourselves with people who are just like us and therefore likely to share our biases. So the more restricted we are in the diversity of the people that we mix with, the more we will suffer from confirmation bias. And of course, in this sort of fragmented society that we live in at the moment, it actually takes quite a lot of effort and courage to spend time with people who are radically different from you, who might think totally different, have different priorities, different beliefs, and so on. But by avoiding those situations, keeping away, maybe in the UK context, maybe you're a Remainer, and you really don't want to talk to your neighbors who voted for Brexit. You think, oh God, this is way too painful. Why did they do this? you don't want to talk about to them, and the same the other way around. The more you just move in your in-group, the more you will be subject to confirmation bias. And this is, of course, happening on social media in a big way. A lot of the algorithms, say in Facebook, will sooner or later show you only the news stories that will fit your opinions. So all you ever see all day long, if social media are your main source of news, is stories which fit to the way you are thinking already. So I think this is becoming more and more of an issue in the world that we live in, and we just need to be acutely aware of it and just make sure that we mix with people from all sorts of different groups, listen, really listen, actively listen to people who have diametrically opposed opinions to our own, and hopefully grow with that and shift our own positions as well. In the business environment, I think we are very aware of the dangers of groupthink, of just discarding certain information, certain opinions because they don't fit. So this is another area where confirmation bias can be seen alive and kicking. So I mentioned on the last slide the benefits of diversity and the danger of losing out on those if we are too biased. So let's collect a few ideas from all of you. So what would you say benefits of diversity are? What's good about that openness, about listening, taking on different opinions and so on? What are the benefits of that? Yep, you learn a lot. Mm-hmm. Different perspectives, new ideas, opening eyes to new things, varied ideas, being able to learn from the varied perspectives. Yeah, new ideas to challenge what has been done in the past and therefore introduce new innovation, the so-called disruptive thinking, which moves us forward. Creativity and innovation, different ideas, learn from others, broadening horizons without necessarily traveling. Mm-hmm. A broader sense of understanding about others, great. Helps to be a common sense check if you have someone from a particular culture. Okay, I can see this is something that is really dear to all of you because we've got loads of input. Yeah, allowing organizations to represent their customer, the consumer base. Great. Yes, lots of confirmation there. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so I think I don't need to convince you, the people on this webinar, of the benefits of diversity, just to point out a few here, as you have done as well. Several of you mentioned this, the wider range of perspectives and experiences. Somebody saying here, blurs the hard lines between cultural differences. Yeah. Respect for each other, as we realize that there are many ways of seeing the same object. Yeah, absolutely. Disruptive thinking, somebody had that as well. Avoiding groupthink. New ideas can come into the discussion. Clearer communication. So if everybody is from different backgrounds, we actually need to be a lot clearer in the way we communicate. And that might just expose sort of gaps in the thinking or illogical things that were just sort of covered up through beautiful language before. So that's another advantage. Hopefully it leads to a more flexible and open approach. And there are many more advantages. The reason why I'm talking about this is to just point to the dangers of unconscious bias, of closing down people too quickly, closing down conversations too quickly, and putting people into boxes too quickly. So at the same time, we are here on the platform provided by the London School for International Communication, and we do a lot of work on culture. And we do talk about things like this, which are sort of cultural dimensions. We talk about the usefulness of thinking about the different sort of preferences and trends that different cultural groups might have when it comes to certain cultural dimensions, such as, for example, hierarchy. And I do believe very firmly that there is value in this, that you need to talk to people about differences in, say, leadership styles, management approaches across the world, ranging from a more hierarchical style to a more egalitarian style. If you don't talk about these things, then you are not supporting people in the way that you could. As long as we absolutely bear in mind the dangers of unconscious bias and of jumping to conclusions, of stereotyping too quickly. So this is a little bit of a dilemma almost. How much of this do you use? And where is the line where you really, really need to look at the individual? Because the way we work, for example, with this continuum, if you've been on other courses on this platform, you will have seen this before, is that we talk about these different preferences that certain cultures have. So, for example, in the area of are they more relationship focused or are they more task focused? And as a German, I can 100% tell you that task focused is something that I experience regularly when I'm at the interface between a German group of delegates and people from, say, Latin America or the Mediterranean cultures. I'll have an example of that in a minute. So we talk about this continuum between, say, the hierarchical end and the egalitarian end, the collectivist end and the individualist, relationship-focused, task-focused, and so on. All very valid stuff. We can talk about preferences that certain countries will have on here, and the focus is on preferences. Certain subcultures within a national culture might have certain preferences. Organizations, there are some organizations which put enormous effort into building a corporate culture and addressing these areas. In some cases, that's pure lip service. In other organizations, it actually really has an impact on the way people relate to each other. And of course, individuals. And that's the crucial point here. So even if we have certain national preferences and trends, when it comes to all these categories, individual people might be completely different. And that's where unconscious bias can kick in. So just a few examples here of unconscious bias when working internationally. So you might be meeting a woman, and I'm not saying you, let's say one. And we all know that there are people like this, and maybe occasionally we've been subject to this sort of thinking ourselves. So you meet a woman from Saudi Arabia in a group of people, and you think, oh, she can't possibly be in charge here. She's only a woman. That would be an example of unconscious bias when, in fact, if you look at the reality in business in Saudi Arabia, there are now plenty of women in positions of responsibility. A lot of women in Saudi Arabia are very highly educated, but I'm sure there are still a lot of people out there who would react with this type of unconscious bias. Yeah. Another example, surely he's the most senior person. He's by far the oldest. So we think that age or some people in some cultures might think that age automatically implies seniority. I heard this in Germany 2 weeks ago. This is the exact quote from one of my delegates talking about Italian colleagues. They can't possibly as hardworking as we are. They spend all their time drinking coffee. So let's not comment on that. Let's not go into that. But I heard this. That was a clear example of unconscious bias. He must be very junior. He arrived at work on a bicycle. So this is from Erin Meyer's brilliant book, The Culture Map. She has this example of a Danish manager who always cycles everywhere and arrives at work in his t-shirt and his jeans with his hair all squashed from his bicycle helmet. And then this Danish manager is transferred to China to run a part of the company's operations there. And in terms of his status, people are utterly confused because for a high status person in China, usually the expectation would be more to have a really nice flashy car, to hopefully have a chauffeur as well who drives you to work, but not to arrive all sweaty on a bicycle for a senior leader. So this is again where bias can kick in and you think, God, this guy can't possibly be very senior, when in fact he is. Look at how she's dressed. She can't be serious about business. Oh, and this one is from my own personal experience. I worked in the IT industry in Germany for a very long time, and we have this massive big computer show in Hanover called CeBIT. I was in technical marketing, so I was fairly technical, but the number of times people would come up to me at the show, at the stand, and say, can I speak to somebody technical? And that was purely based on the fact that I'm a woman. I lost count of that. Yeah. So again, a techie in IT doesn't look like me. A techie in IT is always a man, usually. Yeah. So just examples of unconscious bias and how they can, what they can actually look like. Okay. So what do we actually do about this? What can we do about unconscious bias, bearing in mind that every one of us is subject to that? Okay, so one useful tool is the so-called ladder of inference. So starting at the bottom of the ladder, let's take the example of those 130 scientists in the US who were sent an identical CV, but then judged the men very differently from the women. And what was really interesting about that is that quite a few of those scientists were women. Yeah, so we're quite often biased against ourselves as well. So a useful process can be to start at the bottom here with observing reality. What are the real facts that I should be using? And in the case of those CVs, there's clearly a lot of data there, real facts that should lead anyone who reads this to a pretty balanced and accurate depiction of a person. Selecting reality. So this is already when we're starting to sort of change reality. Which facts have I chosen to use and why? And that's clearly something around the name here. Yeah. Interpreting reality. Why have I understood the situation this way? What's behind that? Making assumptions. What am I assuming and why? Yeah. So there's clearly a lot of assuming going on here about the differences between men and women. Forming conclusions. So why did I draw this conclusion? Why did I think that the men would be worth paying another 10,000 a year? Adopting beliefs. What beliefs led to this action? So this is a lot more profound than further down the ladder. And then taking action. Why have I chosen this course of action? Yeah. So of course, this is quite a drawn out process, but if you just take away 2 or 3 of those questions, because they're not always all relevant all the time, but I really like this one here. Which facts have I chosen to use and why? Yeah. So just take away 1 or 2 of these, and next time you find yourself jumping to conclusions and judging someone quite quickly, just ask yourself, that particular question that jumps out at you on this list. So to summarize useful behaviors when it comes to unconscious bias, I think be very, very aware of the fact that everybody is biased. You will never get to the point where you can claim that you have no bias in the way that you look at the world. And if you're accepting that, then you'll hopefully be a lot more aware of it. Get to know your own biases. There are a host of useful online tests that you can do. A famous one is Project Implicit, run by Harvard. If you just Google that, it's readily accessible, and you can explore your biases in all sorts of areas, from age to gender to ethnicity and so on. And that's a really useful thing to do. Just be aware of the stories out there, the news stories, the coverage about inequalities relating to all the aspects of diversity, because the more you pay attention, the more you will be aware of those sorts of issues. Treat people as individuals first, and be aware of your own assumptions. Have it in the background. If you're meeting somebody from Germany, for example, that there is a strong task focus, but don't judge every person from that culture in exactly the same way. It can be a useful bit of information, and hopefully it's helpful, but individuals can be very, very different. Stop and understand your reactions before you act. I know that's difficult, but the more you become aware of this and sort of just watch yourself, monitor yourself a little bit, hopefully it can become more normal. And treat all those embarrassing incidents of unconscious bias as useful nuggets from which to learn. I think we probably all, as we're on this webinar now, have got one or two examples in our heads where you thought, oh God, yeah, I did that. I reacted in this way to so-and-so, when in fact that was absolutely nothing to do with reality. So we probably try and push those out of our mind and think, oh God, I don't want to go back there. I don't want to think about it. But see them as gifts, as useful nuggets that you can learn from going forward, so you can hopefully be a bit more sensitive in similar situations going forward. And don't be biased against yourself. Quite often, this bias even extends to ourselves. So to you as a woman, if you are a woman, to you as part of a certain background, the worst thing you can hear is something, oh, this is not for people like us. Yeah, people shutting down their options, their possibilities, just based on restrictive thinking and bias. So don't be biased against yourself. Okay, so that's what I had prepared for you. So over to Kathy, I guess, to moderate any questions that there might be.
Thank you, Heike. That was so interesting and insightful, and I'm certainly going to dig out my copy of the Daniel Kahneman book and revisit that. I'm conscious that some people may need to disappear with meetings on the hour, but let's open the floor to questions. I can see there's one from Leo here who raised something earlier. My question is, since everyone is biased, should I, knowing my clients are biased, exploit those biases to show my seniority by dressing and driving the right car? It's an interesting question, isn't it? I'm not sure what you think, Heike. I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that is utterly superficial, isn't it? So I always think things like how someone dresses is not necessarily an integral part of who they are, but they are a certain person with certain values and beliefs and priorities and purpose, and I think that's what matters. And if you can achieve your purpose better by dressing a certain way or adhering to certain bits of etiquette or protocol, then I personally would say that's just do it. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that you can bring yourself to work and that your purpose is that you can live by that, and your values and how you dress, to me, is just superficial. It really doesn't matter. So if I went to a different culture and I had to dress in a certain way, I would just do it, as long as I can be myself.
I guess it's a question of, are we respecting the cultural norms, or are we doing something more manipulative? Does that make sense, Leo? I mean, yeah. Okay, great. We do have a couple more minutes, so if anyone else has any questions, but while people are typing, we will send through the recording, as I said, either today or tomorrow, and I'll make sure we include some of the books and references that Heike has mentioned throughout the call for you. I can see a few people are having to head off. And it's been great. So thank you everyone who's participated. I think it shows how important this topic is, that we've had such a busy session and lots of participation. It does look like people are starting to disappear. So as you always know, feel free to contact us afterwards. We're always happy to continue the conversation. We do have another webinar next month. Let me quickly just share that with you. A very kind of practical session on bridging cultural gaps next month in June. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself. So look out for the invite for that one soon. And as you know, we run all sorts of programs. This is working across cultures that Heike delivers to some of our clients for us. So let us know if you want any more information. But otherwise, thank you so much again, Heike. It's been really interesting. I hope I'm speaking for everyone on the call in saying that. And yeah, thank you all. Stay in touch, and we'll hopefully see you on the next one. Have a great day.